The themes of Sublime are embedded into the content of the movie, but the biggest theme of the movie really is this idea of fear. And the movie really is an exploration of fear. Fear is something that I would argue motivates so many of us. It's something that many of us are consumed by. People like Adolf Hitler, in the most horrific extremes, could be of somebody who one could say was consumed by fear. You could say that all of the leaders of all of the countries right now dealing with terrorism are consumed by a certain degree of fear and lack of understanding of other people. White people are afraid of people of color, perhaps, and people who are disadvantaged all of a sudden rising up. White upper middle class people I'm talking about rising up and taking revenge, if you will, on white upper middle class society by virtue of their disadvantage. We've seen it in Hurricane Katrina, the disequilibrium and the complete sort of socio-economic schism that exists in our country. And fear is ever present. You walk down the street at night and people who you don't necessarily know or have a sense of apprehension about are coming at you in the other direction. All of a sudden your heart skips a beat and fear consumes us, and it consumes us in so many different ways. So the large thing that we wanted to deal with in this movie, especially if you're doing, hopefully, a thinking man's horror film, is something that deals with, in the most macro of levels, this sort of theme of fear. So the film really does deal with that in a very, very direct way. But for all of us, we are, conscious beings to whom we have with whom, or, we have a subconscious. Coming into our subconscious are things that show up oftentimes in dreams and manifest themselves in all sorts of different ways. This is a film that deals with that particular process, where something that you just notice, something that you may have overheard, or an interaction you have with a person may feel innocuous and sort of hidden at the moment, but all of a sudden manifests itself in a dream. And it manifests itself in a movie that sort of leans itself into a bit of the horror genre, in potentially horrific and scary and fearful kind of way. So all of the issues of subconscious input are dealt with in this particular movie too. Issues of romance, issues of jealousy, issues of a parent dealing with a daughter and what one's fears might be about how a child of yours might ultimately turn out, the sort of distance that you have from a child, and what the sort of extreme manifestation of that distance might be. So we're taking the fears and fear fantasies and subconscious issues of basically modern people and holding them up to the looking glass in Sublime, so they manifest themselves in very interesting ways. And we've woven that through a story that is surprising. And as I said, what it is that you see in this movie is ultimately not what it is that you get.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens to George. Obviously, don't get too specific because we don't want to give too much away. But what happens to George in this film? You've talked about how he goes into the hospital, but what happens while he's there?
What happens to George Greaves while he's in the hospital is a series of medical complications that begin very, very innocently with just a scratch that he receives on his leg as he's being put into a wheelchair.
Sorry. Can we go back?
Sure. Not a problem. What happens to George Greaves is a series of medical complications that begin when he goes in for his routine colonoscopy at the Mount Abaddon Hospital. It, at first, is just a small scratch that happens to him when he gets put into a wheelchair. But that small scratch begins to metastasize, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it turns into a bacteria that begins to ravage his body. It evolves into a flesh-eating bacteria that begins to spread all over his leg. Certain things happen to his leg. He gets an operation that is the wrong operation. The colonoscopy that he was supposed to get is actually not what it is he gets. He gets something called a sympathectomy. The sympathectomy is a real operation. Coincidentally, it's a cure, believe it or not, for sweaty palms. It really exists. The use of the word sympathectomy is a purposeful use of it. It has to do with sympathy, and it's an operation to give him a little sympathy, and there's a whole sort of subtextual kind of meaning behind that. George Greaves, I might want to add, is a little bit of a play on words, that we're grieving for George. George Greaves is not unlike the current president of the United States, George W. Bush, who many of us are grieving for, that he frankly is president, and the way that he's handling his administration is something that the world is grieving for, and that's purposeful. And the characters, by the way, in this movie represent certain ideas. George, one might argue, represents, believe it or not, the United States of America. What happens to George Greaves as he walks down an alley and gets cold-cocked? He walks into a hospital and gets the wrong surgery handed to him, and then a series of things happen to him as a result of that initial complication, is frankly not unlike what's happening to the United States at this moment in time as we walk down the alley of Iraq, and we've walked down the alleys of sort of pissing off the rest of the world based on our inability to understand other people because we were afraid, and justifiably so, based on the attacks that happened on 9/11. But the fear that this country is sort of dealing with is very analogous to the fear that George Greaves is dealing with. And the other characters in our movie, Billy, his brother, who, as he says to George... Yeah. So George is dealing with fear in much the same way that the United States is dealing with fear. And Billy, his brother, who tells George that he's experienced things far outside of the bubble that George and their sort of upper middle class white world have experienced. Billy just came back from Africa and India, and he's a bit of a hippie, is frankly synonymous with or metaphoric for Europe, strangely. The brother to America, who has a different perspective, who says that perhaps some of the things that you, America, think is not necessarily the only way to think about the world, but there may in fact be things outside of the bubble in which you are living that might have some relevance to your experience in the world. Billy represents Europe. George represents the United States of America. There is a sort of symbolic embedding of metaphor in this movie that on a sort of closer exploration will find itself for the viewer who's interested to be very, very interesting. And the choice of George Greaves as a name for this character was specifically chosen in reference to the current president of the United States.
Let's talk about some of the other characters. You mentioned Billy already, but Jenny, Zoe, Dr. Shirazi, Mendingo, how do they all work into the story and work with George in his story?
Jenny, who is played by Kathleen York, who does, I think, an extraordinary job as George's wife, in addition to Dr. Shirazi, who is his Iranian surgeon who is going to perform the colonoscopy, who is played wonderfully by Kaz Anvar. Mendingo, if that's his name, is the name of the male nurse who Lawrence Hilton Jacobs plays, who, by the way, gives such an extraordinary performance. It's worthy of putting Larry in the same category as Sam Jackson and Lawrence Fishburne. Lawrence Hilton Jacobs is an actor that I would argue is every bit, pound for pound, as powerful as those actors, and hopefully this movie will allow for a rediscovering of who Lawrence Hilton Jacobs is. So all the different characters, Mendingo, the male nurse, Jenny, George's wife, Dr. Shirazi, the Iranian surgeon who performs this operation on George, represent, as I've been talking about, a certain level of fear and a certain level of participation in George's life. Jenny, as we discover at the beginning of the movie, is in the middle of a bit of a crisis relative to her marriage with George. She's 40-ish, and her kids are getting ready to leave the nest. And for Jenny, she married George when she was young, and she isn't certain now whether or not she wants to spend the rest of her life without anything to necessarily do, as is the case for women who had kids early. It's what do you do, and where is the meaning of your life once your kids leave the nest? So Jenny has been exploring opportunities and options for her, which might include volunteer work overseas. So we come into the movie where the question of what's going to be happening to their relationship, George and Jenny's, is very much up for grabs. And with a husband who is dealing with that particular issue, fear begins to creep in and fear fantasies begin to creep in as to what it is that that might mean for him. When he goes into the hospital and meets Dr. Shirazi, turns out to be an Iranian doctor. How curious that is that America, George Greaves, is being operated on by Iran, an Iranian doctor, Dr. Shirazi. Not by chance was that particular idea put into the script. And it isn't by chance that Dr. Shirazi does something to George that is absolutely catastrophic. So Iran and our fear fantasies about Muslim fundamentalism and the issues in the Middle East are absolutely embedded in this particular picture. Lawrence Holton Jacobs plays a unusual male nurse. He has a red bow tie reminiscent of the Nation of Islam and the followers of the Nation of Islam, which is interesting because for white upper middle class people, the vision of black people, especially in the Nation of Islam, evokes a certain larger fear fantasy about African Americans than perhaps we might be prepared to admit. And in fact, Mandingo, which is the name that Lawrence Holton Jacobs' character gives himself, is perhaps the ultimate name of fear fantasy that white men have relative to a black man. You know, a guy who's going to, steal your wife and who is stronger than you are and more powerful than you are and is sort of the representation of our racial sort of stereotypes about black people. The male nurse says to George that that's his name, and we don't know whether or not he's being truthful or if he's really just screwing with George Greaves. And I would argue that it's a little bit in between, because as we discover, what is happening in this movie isn't necessarily what is really, really happening in this movie. So the Lawrence Holton Jacobs character represents a whole series of fear fantasies, and it gets very specifically discussed in a monologue that I would argue is powerful and extraordinary and wonderfully written and is edgy and crazy and, pull out all the stops as anything I've seen in the motion picture business. A monologue that Mandingo gives George when he's hooked up to his ventilator, literally sitting on his chest and telling George what time it is and what's really, really happening inside the mind of a white upper middle class person.
Let's talk about some of the actors. Tom Cavanaugh plays George, and I said this to Eric, you don't expect Tom Cavanaugh, who I interviewed and was just as charming and goofy as you would expect him to be, to play this kind of role. But from what I saw and from what I've heard from you and from Eric, the performance is, he transcends his personality and goes into a character that is just absolutely amazing. So tell me a little bit about him.
Well, Tom Cavanaugh is the secret weapon in Sublime. He is a genius. He is an absolute genius as an actor. I assume he's a genius as a person, but as an actor, he is a genius. And, I've had the pleasure as a television producer and as an agent to have worked with and represented many of the great actors who are working currently. Tom Cavanaugh blows them all away. Tom is an actor who is best known for a television series that he was the star of, which was called Ed. And perhaps the concern about Tom is that there's a everyman quality to him, a nice guy quality to him, and that people are unaware of the levels and complexity and intelligence and just sheer skill that he brings to a particular role. When we were looking for an actor for George Greaves, we were really thinking about this everyman quality. If it were a motion picture and we had an unlimited budget, Tom Hanks would be really the prototype for America's everyman, a Jimmy Stewart kind of person. For the budget that we had, Tom Cavanaugh was our first choice. Eric and I felt that Tom was perfect. And as the miracle was and happened, Tom loved the script as much as we loved him for the script and agreed to star in the part. We're currently cutting the movie, and Tom is in every scene of the movie. He is brilliant, and the arc of his character that he plays is really extraordinary and goes from 0 to 60 in surprising and unbelievable ways. Tom knew everything when he was acting on the set. It's interesting because we're editing the movie right now, and obviously we're dealing with all the footage And one of the issues when you're editing a picture is, does an actor match his performance in close-up and medium shots and wide shots? And is he cuttable by virtue of the matching of performance? And it's not just what it is that the actor says, but it is what it is he does in terms of body movements. And is his arm raised in one shot versus his arm being lowered in another shot? The editor and Eric and I, sitting up there right now in the editing room, are literally shaking our heads, saying that we have never seen an actor in all of our experiences. And our editor, Robert Florio, has cut maybe 100 movies. We've never seen an actor who matches as perfectly and seamlessly and magnificently as Tom Cavanaugh does. And that's just a piece of his performance. That's just the physicality and awareness that he brings to his performance to make our lives easy as it relates to cutting this picture. The other stuff that he brings to the performance, viewers of this movie will see. And I hope that Tom Cavanaugh is recognized as he should be, you know, right up there, frankly, with actors, and I kid you not, like Dustin Hoffman and Jack Nicholson. He is, and Tom Hanks. He is in that category. He just has not been discovered yet. And in the same way that I think Lawrence Hilton Jacobs will be discovered anew, maybe in the way that Travolta was rediscovered off of Pulp Fiction, Tom Cavanaugh will be discovered for who he really, really is, as both a leading man and a character actor, in the same way that Jack Nicholson and Dustin Hoffman have had those kinds of careers.
Let's talk about Catherine. Oh, okay. The one person we haven't really talked about was Catherine Cunningham Eves, who plays Zoe. So tell me a little bit about Zoe's character, and then tell me about Catherine playing her.
Well, Catherine Cunningham Eves, who is a relatively speaking a newcomer to motion pictures and starring roles in motion pictures, plays Zoe, who is the nurse that administers to Tom Cavanaugh's character, George Greaves. It was interesting because Catherine came in on the first day of casting. And after she left, the air was completely sucked out of the room. I turned to everybody and I said, "It's Zoe. She's Zoe. We don't need to cast anymore. We found her. She's perfect." She is the perfect blend for this character of a beautiful woman. She is absolutely stunning, and I think this will do wonders for her career. An honest performance that is deep and profound, and there is also a very interesting, lovely, light quirkiness to her, which is part of her humor and part of her charm, because when you're that beautiful and that talented and that deep, and you also have a kind of quirkiness to her, you have what it is that makes Julia Roberts, frankly, and Cameron Diaz so special. You know, David Lynch, who I used to represent and was the producing partner to on Mulholland Drive, and when I was an agent, I packaged Twin Peaks, has always had an eye for casting and finding extraordinary femme fatales in his movies. I think that for Sublime, we found our extraordinary femme fatale in Catherine Cunningham Eves, who plays Zoe. I could not be happier with her performance. It is extraordinary. It is unusual. It gives the film a level to it that she perfectly fits. And I could never think of another actress, be they the biggest stars in the world, who could have played this part as well as Catherine did.
How far you guys got into you now?
We're about the halfway mark.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, and today I think we hit halfway.
So what is the real name of the film now?
Sublime.
Good, that's what I wrote down.
Good.
All right, so tell me, what is Sublime about in very general idea?
In very general terms, what's it about? Well, the story it tells and what it's about are, in this case, really kind of two different things. I mean, because it is a bit of an allegory and sort of a socio-political statement, I guess, about white upper middle class fear and unconsciousness in general. But it's in the guise of I guess what one could call a horror film or a psychological thriller. The story is the story of a man named George Greaves, who is a successful white upper middle class male with a beautiful family. And he, on his 40th birthday, has scheduled a routine colonoscopy and goes into the hospital for this routine procedure. And when he wakes up out of anesthesia, he has not received a colonoscopy. He's received somebody else's procedure, another actually surgery, and because he's been mistaken for another patient, and the iatrogenic nightmare that he goes through, the medical duress that he suffers within this hospital and in the course of the film is pretty scary. It's horrifying what the man goes through.
Can I have 1 second? I'm sorry.
You getting the shirt?
Okay.
Can you explain the word iatrogenic?
Mm-hmm. It's
If you mind saying iatrogenic.
iatrogenic is a Greek word. It's a Greek root, iatros meaning physician and genos, born from. And iatrogenic illness is an illness essentially that's caused by medical treatment. And the statistics are fairly alarming. One statistic has it that about 780,000 iatrogenic deaths occur every year. That's 7,800,000 in the course of 10 years, which is more than all the casualties in all the wars that we've fought in this country. One could make the argument that our healthcare system is the nation's number one killer.
So let's go back to the idea, because
Okay.
we've discussed this before, but where you and Tony, I believe, came up with the idea kind of together as you were driving around. Just tell me how the idea comes up for Sublime. Where do you come up with it?
Well, I think the idea really originated with Tony, and he was really moved, as I think most of the nation, if not the world, was by Terry Schiavo's plight, you know, and I think that was the catalyst for the whole thing. You know, there's a universal fear I think that everybody has, and especially, I don't even know if it's especially men, but at a certain age of what starts to go wrong, and the care that one must take with oneself, and there's only one place to go. It's to these hospitals, these buildings that are filled with sick people and also filled with people in white coats that you can trust. And I think it's a sort of a universal fear of going into a hospital and never being able to get out. You know, there are these buildings that we all end up in at some point or another, some a lot earlier than others, and some very unexpectedly. And the notion of being able to go into a hospital with one condition and hopefully come out, but maybe with another condition, it's terrifying, and I think it's a universal fear. Everybody fears hospitals even more than they do dentists.
So how does this idea become the film Sublime?
It really began with the idea of what would happen if a man went into a hospital for a routine procedure and everything just started to go horribly wrong. And that sort of naturally, in trying to figure out what the film was really about, because there's a difference between plot and, you know, and meaning, really. Ideally, hopefully. I mean, you know, there are a lot of strictly plot-driven or strictly character-driven pieces that we're all used to. But I mean, cinema, and just like theater, is always really about something. It's about something else, and it's a dramatization of a real dynamic, and hopefully a universal dynamic. And in this case, it was an opportunity to look at all of the things that we've come to fear, and how we sort of, you know, if you spend your life worrying or fearing, then in some ways the only way your life has meaning is if those fears become real. Because if they never manifest, then you've just wasted your life worrying about something that there's, you know, no need to worry about. And yet we are, even particularly today, it seems that most of our choices, our actions and reactions are all fear-based. You know, and we're in a socio-political climate that seems to sort of prey on our fears. And people are most easily manipulated by, you know, 4 emotions: fear, feeding, fighting, and sex. And which would actually make, you know, 4 great films, one about each. And if we were to do that, this would be the one really about fear and what happens when your worst fears really manifest in front of you and you lose control. And also the notion that we really give up control. We don't know what's inside the dark. The dark unknown is always out there, and we're sort of taught by our parents to fear the unknown. And if you never go there, and if you never confront those fears, well, then, you know, have you really become a whole person yet? that's also part of the story. I mean, as a result of what George goes through, and he is very much an everyman. And we don't want to see anything bad happen to this guy. But what he goes through enables him to ultimately make an act of power and take control over his life rather than giving it up to the authority figures or the establishment that the hospital really represents. He has to finally make a choice.
So you and Tony sit down and you come up with this idea.
Yeah.
And then I think we had talked about this before as well. Does he let you go off and write this on your own, or is it the two of you working together? How does that writing process work between the two?
This whole project began because of friendship, really. And it was not a kind of a classic producer-director finding a writer. We'd been working on a couple of projects together, and this was an affair of the heart for him. And I recognized it as such, and I thought it was a remarkable opportunity to take a fairly short amount of time, and because I didn't have a lot of time, and produce something that was sort of handmade. Because we have a fairly long history together, I just went off and wrote it, and then we read it, went through, I think, 2 polishes of the script, and that were actually the original script was, I think, 116 pages, and then all we did was cut it down to its fighting weight, about 95 pages. That's all we really did. It was just making edits. And then shot it in 15 days, and for 25 cents. But luckily, because of his reputation, his passion, enthusiasm, and I think the story that we were telling and the script, we attracted a really kind of remarkable cast. It was important from the very beginning with this that since it was such a handmade project and such a labor of love for everybody involved, that we take the time to cast this thing appropriately. Not just appropriately, but with a brand of actor who were able to carry this thing and do it even if it was on a stage. There are a lot of different kinds of actors, and we decided to take our time in casting this thing and find and assemble just exactly the right ensemble for the piece. And then what happened was really unusual, I think. I mean, our partnership was quite unique here, and what we did on the set was unusual. Rather than there being Tony, just the director, in charge of everything, we created a triumvirate that really is kind of common sense. It's more common in theater, where the director and the playwright have a very intimate relationship, and neither of them do anything without the other's assent. In this case, it was a very similar kind of dynamic between me and Tony. By this time, I was also a co-producer of the film. But we also brought in Dermot Downs, the cinematographer. So the guy taking the pictures, the guy who wrote the words, and the guy who was in charge of directing the entire film were working together as a team. And the effect that this had on the set was really remarkable. With everybody watching out for everybody else's back, I think it created a sense of security on the set for the actors that allowed them to take chances. And they did. And when actors take chances, you get really surprising performances. And yeah, I mean, down to the crew. Everybody realized that we were all working together as a team to fashion something, to make a real motion picture, a film, instead of just churning out another movie, But when a union guy comes up to you and says, "This is the best set I've ever been on," and you're shooting for 16 hours a day, I mean, it's a pretty good sign. It's sort of all about the spirit of, I think, really old-fashioned filmmaking. If the work is good enough, if you cast it well enough, if everybody's doing it for the right reasons, if your purpose is pure and your intent is impeccable, things come together in a remarkable and sort of magical way. And so far so good. It's the end result is something I think we're going to be very proud of, but it's going to be very unusual. It's really hard to characterize this movie in Hollywood speak. It's not a genre film in the least.
Let's talk a little bit about the film itself. Tell me a little bit about what the character George goes through in the film.
The film is a bit of a puzzle because during his time in the hospital, sometimes because of his medication, sometimes just to escape the reality of what is happening to him, he closes his eyes. And every time he does, he flashes back to the night before, where there was this very intimate party at his home, a birthday party for him. And the bits and pieces of those memories are all sort of, you assemble in the course of watching the story and realize really what happened that night. And he's put on the spot. He's a guy who, he's an IT consultant, whatever that really is, a consultant of it, and he's made a lot of money and has a beautiful home. And his brother has shown up at this party and puts him on the spot and essentially asks him a really tough question, but it comes from a place of real love. He puts him on the spot and says, what have you got to show for it? You're 40 years old, but what can you really point to? What are you really doing with your life? Are you making a life or are you making a living? It's a really obnoxious thing to ask somebody, you know, especially on their 40th birthday. But he's forced to really think about it, and the only answer he can really give is that he's made his wife happy. And Billy challenges him, his brother challenges him on this, says, how do you know? And the assumptions that George has made about his life and about his success and about what he has accomplished, about who his children are, about who his wife is and her own happiness, the notion that you can tell by looking in someone's eyes whether or not they're happy. You can tell something about somebody's soul by looking in their eyes is, I think, really kind of specious. I mean, the eyes might be the window to the soul, but I think most of the time the blinds are closed. And it's very rare that you really are able to get an insight into somebody else's reality just by looking at them. And the sort of masters of the universe that you know, the white upper middle class males of the world represent or think of themselves as, they have a lot of hubris in terms of being able to look into somebody's eyes or look or make assumptions about another country, another tradition, another way of thinking. And we make a lot of assumptions and we act based on those assumptions, and they're not accurate a lot of the time. And so George is sort of forced to confront that and to really question the assumptions he's made. He is also one, because of his experiences, and I can't get into it in too much specificity here or too much detail because it would ruin the film, he really ends up confronting all of his most preternatural fears. And as those manifest, I think one will realize that the fears that he confronts are really sort of universal fears. And there are a lot of them. And he has to live through and navigate his way through a real, genuine sort of cabinet of horrors.
Not to get too specific, because you're mentioning some of those fears, let's talk about how some of the other characters, Jenny, Dr. Shirazi, the nurse, a.k.a. Mandingo, Zoe, how do they work into the story with him?
How do they work in the story with him?
And you can bring up each individual character. You can kind of talk. Obviously,
Okay.
Jenny is you know, you can kind of discuss his wife, so you can get a little bit more into her.
All
and
right.
then if you want to discuss the rest of the characters in terms of how they fit in with the hospital and with, you know, because I know what happens there, but you don't want to tell anyone.
If I don't think it would be appropriate. If George is this everyman that is sort of touched by God and selected to go through this remarkable experience and all of this pain and suffering to come ultimately to a realization of some sort of truth, his wife is, I hope, what we've managed to craft here is a very, very real woman at age 40 who is confronting this moment as she approaches middle age where her children are both essentially grown and launched. She's realizing she'll never probably hold her own child in her own arms again. The childbearing years are over, and she's facing an uncertain future in a youth-dominated, fear-driven market. And she can either choose to start all over again, or she can face spending the next 30 or 40 years of her life, depending on her husband, to provide for her and wondering what to do with her time and what to worry about. George's children, Ned is a 15-year-old, a bit of a prodigy, but he's a smart young man who is fascinated by I think some of the hypocrisy that he sees in his parents and in the assumptions they made and the things that they're not looking at, and he has an informed 15-year-old's point of view about his own parents and the next generation, and his particular journey is something I don't know even how to talk about it and without going tango union here. Similarly, George's daughter Chloe is a 16-year-old overachieving athlete who loves her father desperately and is sort of seeking her father's approval. Billy, his brother, is sort of the voice of, I think, truth in the story. Truth without any fear of consequences. You know, I think Billy really represents a sort of true, real fraternal love. And he's willing to and brave enough to ask the hard questions without fear of losing the relationship. You know, I think any friendship, or certainly a fraternal relationship, you have to be able to count on the other one to put you on the spot and to keep you honest and remind you of your own principles. And that's sort of what Billy does. The people of the hospital are, I think, a very generally realistic group. Dr. Shirazi is a young gastroenterologist who is there to perform George's colonoscopy. In some ways is as much a victim of what happens in today's brand of medical care as George is. Dr. Lichterhand, the administrator of the hospital, all have their own, obviously, role to play. I don't quite know how to address that. There is a character who is a bit unusual in this piece. He's a black male nurse with what could be a Nation of Islam bow tie. And the relationship between this gentleman, whose name is Mandingo, and George Greaves is, in some ways, the fundamental and core relationship of the movie. Because the film also, very importantly, I think addresses, and boldly, addresses racism that is still latent and lingers just under the surface of our reality. I mean, I don't know how you can quantify how far we've come since the civil rights movement, but frankly, I don't feel we've made baby steps, and we like to think that we're a lot more evolved and a lot more level-headed and humanistic than we really are. There's still an awful lot of latent racism in this world, and it's addressed very, very boldly and in a sort of a bald-faced way, and in a way I think that will possibly really provoke some people in the film. And that is principally what the relationship between Mandingo and George is really about.